During the last month, I read dozens of Daredevil comics from different eras to understand what makes this character so special. And contrary to what many people think, Daredevil was not always this tragic and tormented hero, with stories that deal with guilt, redemption, and other religious themes. But in his early days, he was a colorful and even funny superhero very similar to Spider-Man. Not only that, but he used to be an unpopular hero from Marvel's least-selling comics. However, the character would later become one of the company's most popular superheroes. There's something extremely attractive about the Devil of Hell's Kitchen. A mix of heroism, street violence, internal conflicts, and tragic events that result in a completely effective combination. But how did a copy of Spider-Man become this great character we know today? That's what we're going to talk about today, because we'll analyze Daredevil comics from various eras to decipher this mystery. I'm Gio the Geek Monitor, and today we'll face Dirty Ball, Hell's Kitchen's guardian devil. Very but very seriously. In the early 60s, Marvel Comics was on a real streak of success, as Stan Lee, along with other cartoonists like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, had created many of the company's most iconic characters in just a couple of years, from the Fantastic Four and Hulk to the X-Men. However, Spider-Man was undoubtedly the most successful of them all, so the editor Martin Goodman ordered Stan Lee to create a character similar to him. By then, Stan Lee had been at Marvel for more than 2 decades. He was accustomed to creating brand new characters weekly based on small concepts like a superpower or a distinct trait. In this case, the concept that Stan wanted to address was that justice is blind. So he thought it would be a good idea to create a blind superhero who was also a lawyer by day. However, Jack Kirby was very busy and Steve Ditko refused to create more heroes with Stan Lee. So the job went to Bill Everett, who had previously created the character of Namor. The story begins directly with Daredevil entering the now famous Fogwell's gym looking for a criminal named Fixer. He encounters several henchmen and confronts them to extract information. But when you read this comic, you soon realize that it's not the Daredevil we know today. Because in addition to his suit being more colorful than what we usually see, he fights, while saying funny or ironic phrases like, "I'm starting to suspect that I'm really not welcome here." Phrases that we currently associate more with Spider-Man. The comic then takes a slight turn, interrupting the action to show a flashback to the character's origin, where Matt's father, a boxer named Jack Murdock, wants his son to be completely different from him. So he forces him to study to become someone important. However, alongside his studies, Matt manages to exercise daily and strengthen his body. Then the usual Marvel-style tragedy occurs. Jack gets involved with a mobster named Fixer, who helps him get some fights despite his age. Additionally, Matt rescues a man on the street, which causes some radioactive chemicals to leave him completely blind, but also gives him senses far superior to those of a normal human being. When Jack Murdock refuses to take a dive in a fight arranged by Fixer, he is killed, leaving Matt Murdock an orphan and eager for justice, whether through legal means or through Daredevil. These elements align with Stan Lee's other stories from the 1960s. We come across the radioactive element that provides powers, the tragedy of losing a loved one, and above all with this idea that Marvel often posed at that time, that in order to be a hero you first had to suffer. A concept very different from what Detective Comics was handling at that time, where characters usually had perfect lives. It's true that this story is far from having a completely tragic focus. Many adversities, like blindness or losing his father, are resolved in a single panel. But certainly it was a kind of diamond in the rough. This origin is revisited and expanded in later stories such as the Netflix series and especially in the comic The Man Without Fear. Stories that do not change this origin but enrich it through narrative details, but we will get to these 2 stories a bit later. In Daredevil, issue number 2, the hero's suffering was highlighted when he battled Spider-Man's foe, Electro. Matt wins the battle but loses new clients. The Fantastic Four disappoints Foggy Nelson and gains a new enemy's hatred due to his double life as Daredevil. It should be clarified that although Matt does suffer in these comics, he faces this suffering in a much more optimistic and less tormented way. Again, getting closer to Spider-Man than what we currently know as the Devil of Hell's Kitchen. A few months later, the cartoonist Wally Wood would change his suit for the iconic red outfit we know today. However, his stories would remain very similar to other comics from the company, with a light focus and more geared towards science fiction than street violence. Some interesting comics exist, like issue 47, where Matt Murdock defends a blind Vietnam veteran and helps him to continue having a purpose in life. Another issue worth mentioning is 119, where we see a religious motif introduced to the character's comics for the first time, as we see a former boxer become a priest. However, the rest of the comic continues to have this light touch that it had until now. In this issue, Matt Smythe as Black Widow, his former comic partner, returns to New York. We see him happily taking the subway and giving his seat to an elderly woman. However, a young talent was about to completely change him. When thinking of Frank Miller's art, you likely envision the crude, rough figures that some critics disapprove of. However, he started drawing in this way a style much more similar to what was seen in other comics in the 80s. He actually began at Marvel illustrating Daredevil, not writing. His cityscapes and film noir influences started gaining public attention. Back then, Daredevil wasn't a popular comic, but the comic began to improve its sales, and Miller, little by little, became more involved in the stories. He became so involved that he developed issues with Daredevil's writer, Roger McKenzie. He gave Marvel an ultimatum: keep Frank or lose him. Marvel chose to retain Frank as the comic's artist and writer. Time proved that this was the right move, as Miller redefined the character and took him from being a pale imitation of Spider-Man to a rising star, who redefined characters like Wilson Fisk, Bullseye, and who would now be a tragic character struggling in a ruthless world, where the line between good and evil became increasingly blurred. The guardian devil trying to do God's work. But Miller was not alone. He was accompanied by inker Klaus Janson, who said in an interview that he felt the team really didn't shine. With their first comics of the character, Janson recounts that Miller and he were new talents, trying to prove themselves. And to Marvel, so Frank was doing the kind of stories that Marvel wanted, improving some concepts while trying not to scare the character's fans, while Janson was imitating the style of the inkers who came before him. According to Janson, the pair's real success came with the character Elektra, but I think he's being modest, because they took over the comic in issue 158, while Elektra appeared in 168, and in these 10 issues, they really did wonders and developed many concepts that, if you're a fan of the Daredevil series, you're sure to identify. Their first major change was to emphasize the character of Ben Urich, the investigative journalist from the Bugle, closely tied to Daredevil's major storylines. Urich not only brings the character closer to this narrative of crime, suspense, and noir cinema, but he becomes a moral compass for the readers. An external view of justice that is not always the same as Matt's. A reporter who also fights for what is right, but uses the pen to expose corruption issues. Furthermore, in these comics, he deciphers Daredevil's secret identity and chooses not to expose it as a regular reporter would, because he understands that there is a greater good obtained by keeping the secret, despite contradicting his career. A narrative motif also seen in Matt Murdock, who dispenses justice as a vigilante despite it going against his profession as a lawyer. Frank's writing also significantly changed the character of Bullseye, who had previously appeared in Daredevil comics. He became a mentally troubled killer with a sick fixation on the devil of Hell's Kitchen who is capable of turning anything into a weapon. Even relationships like when he used Black Widow to hurt Daredevil. But beyond the character feeling more threatening, Miller used him to question Daredevil's morality. Because at this time, Matt Murdock had a very strict moral code and thought that every death was a loss. So we even see him risking his own life to save Bullseye, who had a brain tumor. However, after doing so, Nick Manolis, a police friend, scolds Daredevil for saving Bullseye. He reassures him that the tumor will be cured and it will be blamed for his crimes, leading to his release. Something that indeed happens and makes us wonder, how responsible is Matt Murdock for Bullseye's subsequent crimes, including the deaths of Elektra and Karen Page? During Miller's Daredevil run, Matt throws Bullseye to the pavement from a high point, showcasing the darker tone of this era by Miller and Johnson. It's when we start to see these moral dilemmas, these dark stories that deal with knowing what is right. We also see the return of Wilson Fisk, a former low-level Spider-Man villain. They reinterpret him as a criminal mastermind capable of manipulating those around him and who is tremendously dangerous in hand-to-hand combat. But he's more than just a criminal. He's a temperamental man who seeks to bury his most violent side in order to be happy with his wife Vanessa. This is when we first see this human side of the monster, who is Wilson Fisk, a characteristic that is also taken up in the Daredevil series. They also include elements like the criminal group known as the Hand and Stick, Matt's original mentor. Most notably, Elektra's character was immensely popular in the comics, even though she died shortly after her introduction. Miller and Jansson made great contributions, but in my view, their greatest was to the character, was the fact of incorporating Catholic religion as a central theme, as this gave Daredevil a much deeper and tragic dimension. The Catholic religion made themes such as guilt, sacrifice, and the idea of redemption mark the character's life. Not only that, but it set him apart from the rest of the superheroes. While other characters act under an abstract sense of justice, Matt does so with the conviction that he is fulfilling a kind of penance. Every blow he receives and every loss he suffers are part of a personal crusade that he imposes on himself. As under the standards of the Catholic religion, suffering is seen as a path to redemption. In this way, religion not only gives depth to the character, but it defines the way he sees the world. As a place full of sin and pain, a world on fire that can only be redeemed through his own sacrifice, as he considers himself a soldier of God. The omnibus by Frank Miller and Klaus Jansson, available from Panini, contains all these concepts and stories. Later, Miller left the character to redefine Batman through comics like The Dark Knight Returns. But years later, he returned with two more emblematic stories. The first is the Man Without Fear comic, a reinterpretation of the classic Daredevil origin story from issue number 1, enriching it with various details. For example, here we see how Matt suffered when acquiring his powers, as he suddenly felt overwhelmed by his new senses. His blood felt like it was burning him internally, the sheets felt like sandpaper, and the anesthesia failed to work when the doctors operated on his face. We also see how his father was forced to work as a henchman for Fixer, and how did young Matt seek revenge after his father's death, but accidentally kills a sex worker in the process, a traumatic event that leads him down the path of law. That's why he initially seeks justice through the law, because he feels that giving in to that violent instinct inside him is a sin. As the story unfolds, Matt gradually struggles to move past the constraints of his faith, and he becomes emotionally involved with a woman named Elektra, who leads him to live on the edge of what is right and legal. The comic shows how Matt ultimately finds a balance between legality and morality, so he understands that sometimes he has to break the laws in order to achieve justice. The other historic comic is one of the most iconic for both Daredevil and Marvel. Hey, by the way, if you like this history of superheroes, I'm gonna have a live online talk about the history of Superman. I'll leave the link in the description and a discount coupon so you can book the place if you're interested. How do you break the man without fear? In the comic Born Again, Karen Page, a drug addict, reveals Daredevil's secret identity for a dose. The secret eventually falls into the hands of Wilson Fisk, who uses it to destroy his rival, but he doesn't do it immediately, but gradually. The government freezes his money accounts, accusing him of tax evasion. He incriminates him for receiving a bribe, revokes his lawyer's license, and then destroys his apartment. With each blow, Fisk gradually breaks Matt Murdock's will, who begins to distrust everyone and behave erratically and violently. When an impatient and broken Matt confronts Fisk, he is no match for Kingpin, who easily defeats him and throws him in a taxi at the bottom of the river, bathed in a bottle of whiskey, making everyone believe that the problems finally broke the man without fear. In this story, Matt Murdock loses everything. This concept is also explored in Season 3 of Netflix's Daredevil, albeit with a different storyline, although they do bring back elements like the taxi. The interesting thing here is that this theme of the man who loses everything has to do with two different themes within Daredevil's story. The first relates to his father, Jack Murdock, the boxer who frequently falls but finds the strength to rise again. And the second theme is related to the biblical story of Job, a faithful servant of God whose story is told in one of the books of wisdom. According to this story, God allows the adversary to take everything from Job to test his faith. Something very similar to what Wilson Fisk did to Matt. In fact, in the third season of Daredevil, Matt literally comments that at one point he felt he was Job. Although Miller endowed the character with religious iconography, he was not the only one to explore it. Although Matt Murdock's faith is often seen as a strength, other stories like Guardian Devil by Kevin Smith suggest that it can also be exploited as a weakness. In this comic, Daredevil has to take care of a baby who could well be a messiah or an antichrist. However, Matt is not sure of what the reality is, so he begins to question all his decisions. This doubt, sown by a mysterious enemy, makes him act irrationally, even distrusting allies like the Black Widow. And even at one point in the story, he deliberately endangers the life of that baby. Another interesting point they explore in this comic is the idea that Matt has a resentment towards women. Natasha notices something that makes perfect sense. Since Matt was abandoned by his mother, then he fell in love with a dangerous assassin and was later betrayed by the woman he loved. Other stories like Wake Up by Brian Michael Bendis use other characters close to Daredevil to tell us about him. In this case, they used reporter Ben Urich. This story examines the contradictions between Matt's personalities: lawyer and vigilante, sinner and Catholic. Above all, Urich wonders if Matt Murdock knows when to fight on the side of the law, when to fight as a vigilante, and what happens when he doesn't make the right decision. Some approaches revisit the lighter side of the character, avoiding the darker elements. The comic Yellow by Jeff Loeb and Tim Siegel, part of Marvel's Color series, exemplifies this. Superheroes share deeply personal stories about their greatest loves and meaningful relationships. Daredevil Yellow focuses on Karen Page, Spider-Man Blue on Gwen Stacy, Hulk Grey on Betty Ross, and Captain America White on Bucky. In the specific case of Daredevil, Love and Sale revisit the classic run of Stan Lee and give greater depth to the events we saw in those comics. Through a story in which Matt remembers what his early days as Daredevil were like, the love he felt for Karen Page, and how he laments the fact that she is no longer in this world. Another run where we can also see this lighter approach is Mark Waid's Daredevil, where many people believe they know that Matt Murdock is the devil of Hell's Kitchen, but they can't prove it. And this does cause problems for Matt with his identity, but it's something he addresses more casually and not as tormented as in other comics. However, this lighter approach that Yellow or Waid's run take doesn't seem to last long, as the character tends to go down a darker path, like the one addressed in Chip Zdarsky's run, where we see Daredevil accidentally take the life of an ordinary criminal, which causes the police and the mayor of New York, Wilson Fisk, to try to apprehend him. At a certain point in the story, Daredevil is saved by Punisher, which is also a narrative device we often find in their stories. It was seen in Zdarsky's and Frank Miller's runs, as well as Season 2 of the Netflix series. Daredevil and Punisher have appeared together often, highlighting their differences and similarities. Both are vigilantes, both break the law. But the big difference is that Daredevil not only believes in punishment, but also in redemption, giving criminals a chance to change. Contrasting Frank Castle's approach of acting as judge, jury, and executioner, if you commit a crime, Punisher is what Daredevil would be if he had no morals. And even though they both ultimately seek the same thing, a safer city, their view of justice and the law is completely different. For Matt, the law is flawed but useful, while for Frank, it's a concept that failed long ago. So he believes that he is the only solution. That's why, when these two characters face off, we not only see a battle of fists, but of ideas, where we as readers have to ask ourselves, how far is it okay to break the law to administer justice? And considering that Matt's mercy has led to several deaths, we also have to ask ourselves, who is right between the two? This idea of who has the right to break the law and to what extent. This is also addressed in events like Devil's Reign, where Wilson Fisk uses the power of the Purple Man to try to win re-election as mayor. While in the same comic, we are told that Matt used a similar power to make Fisk forget his secret identity. So, who is Daredevil really, despite his colorful origin? I would say that the true essence of the character lies in that he is a hero in constant conflict, trapped between justice and revenge, faith and doubt. A hero who started optimistic, but who gradually carried the penance of each defeat, each loss, and each sin. His story portrays a man fighting not only against crime but also against himself, questioning how much of himself he is capable of losing in an effort to protect his city. But it is precisely this duality and contradictions that make this character so interesting. Because being such a flawed hero, he is one that comes closer to us than other heroes do. In a world where justice is grey and so blind that there are corners it simply doesn't reach. The stories of Daredevil, the guardian devil of Hell's Kitchen, remind us that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply standing up. If you enjoyed this video analyzing numerous Daredevil stories, check out the playlist I've provided, where I do the same with other characters like Captain America, Joker, and the Penguin.